everybody. It's our brand new premiere episode of The Devil's Advocate at our new home at the Paranormal Encounters Network. Stephen, are you there, buddy?
I am.
Well, we have moved from our old network, which was actually limiting us in certain ways. I won't go into that. But our new network is going to allow us to do video, to actually show videos, to do a lot more things, to have a lot more fun. We can have sponsors. We can actually make a little bit of money, pay for the services that we're getting, and turn it into like a legitimate show for a change. Tonight, we sort of wanted to do like an introductory show and sort of fill people in on Stephen and I, our history together, the history of the podcast itself, where it started and kind of like where we went with it. And we will have music eventually. Theme song, right, Stephen?
Indeed.
So why don't you talk a little bit about how we came to know each other and how the podcast began, and we can just sort of chat about it.
Oh, yeah. Well, you have to correct me with some of the dates, because that was such a long time ago. From what I recall, let's see, I don't know if I caught your reading or you caught my reading. Somehow we got in touch over this whole Spiricom research thing.
Yeah, actually, what happened was, let me just fill you in so that everyone knows. I was doing a hit piece on the whole Spiricom thing and ITC in general, and I came across something you had written that was on the internet, and then I listened to a couple of your interviews on the internet, and then I think I reached out to you, just a quick email kind of, hey, love your work, something like that. And that's kind of how we started our conversation.
That's right. And then I needed a guy who actually knew the nitty-gritty about blueprints, schematics, and all this to really check out this quote-unquote Spiricom device. And, to see if it just was black box technology, if it was something kind of more legitimate than that. So, yeah, I remember now. That's right. Yeah, so that was good times, because we had spoken then a whole lot about our overlapping theories of just about everything.
Life universe.
Grand unified theory, yeah, multiple universes, and how that now plays into kind of your larger thinking about your whole explanatory schema, quite originally, I might say, for EVP, which was experimentally proven, more than 5 years ago. I think you published about it 5 years ago.
Absolutely, and then we decided, just kind of on a lark, that we were going to do a podcast in which you did an incredible amount of post-production work on, and we would interview strange and wonderful people. I think one of our first interviews was with John, my assistant executive director of Spirit Lab. And he's always been a lot of fun to have on the show because he's pretty analytical himself. And then we started getting into the darkness of the paranormal.
In fact, hold on, this is fun. I can tell you the order of those. I believe I can tell you the order of those episodes. John came kind of late. We didn't speak to him. We didn't kind of conference him in for quite a while, believe it or not.
Yeah, we should have John back.
I remember.
We should definitely have. Maybe we'll get John to come on our next show so that we can just talk about all sorts of strangeness. But we did a hit piece originally. I think our first hit piece was on. I think it was on Andy Kopic, wasn't it?
I believe you're right. Yep.
Yeah, Andy was the first one that we did, and we were using some videos he had posted to point out some of the self-induced drama that he was manufacturing, and then we moved on to
Oh, here we go, David. I'm sorry. I have a more exact. I have a 1 through 22. Well, 0 through 22, and 0 came last. But yeah. So first was just introductions. Second was Paratopia. So was third. Well, third was post-Paratopia. Fourth was memes, and that's when we had conferenced in the Dr. Blackmore about memes, and we discussed EVP ratings.
Right.
Then John Keegan came on the fourth, and I, of course, quoted some of your more widely publicized television interview audio, like you were on Comcast and a couple other things. Then came Dr. Persinger, which is my favorite interview. And then we discussed anomalous speech patterns, kind of trying to discern what reverse psycholinguistics or reverse speech was through 7 and 8. And then 9 came the claims of Andy Kopic.
Yes. That was our first real foray into the stains and the paranormal, we called them. And then we did a few of those. We did that, and we also looked at the whole.
Steve Holte came next. Do you remember Steve Holte? Yeah.
Yeah, we did Steve Holte. In fact, Steve still had it.
Tell folks what the claims of Andy Kopic were.
Well, he was using this device. It was a signal tracing wand, a very common device used in IT work, to trace out twisted pairs in a punch-down block for either network or telephone work. And it's an inductive probe amplifier is what it is. And he was claiming he was talking to the dead by using this device, which I find kind of interesting because these devices number in the millions, and lots of telephone men have been using them for years, and none of them talk to the dead. So I was a little dubious about his claims. And then we started looking at his modus operandi with some of the videos that he created, and it was very obvious that he was lowering his head so that you couldn't see his lips, and it looked very much like he was performing a ventriloquist act. So many of the voices that were present sounded like him using a falsetto in his voice to recreate. And it was funny because even Dave Schrader, who interviewed him on a show of his, or was on the video or something, had said, hey, if I didn't know you, I'd say, what's to stop you from just lowering your head and, throwing your voice, which we all thought was funny at the time.
And Schrader sounded just like the voice. It was crazy.
Yeah, Schrader duplicated the voice with his own voice, which that's how Dave Schrader is. I love him for that. But and Dave is an incredible interviewer. So we were sort of exposing the BS out there quite a bit, and then there's just so damn much BS out there that you could totally turn that into a lifetime career doing that, and nobody wants to hear that every week. So then we started going into some other interesting side trips, and we started talking about some of the research. And tell us a little bit about your background, Stephen.
Oh, well, the great thing about, I'll keep it obtuse if you don't mind, because while we do use our real names, we don't like to give the crazy people, and there will be a few who listen. I know I'm not speaking to most folks listening out there, but there will be crazy people who will go to any extent once their worldview is shattered by way of evidence or alternative opinion. They will go through any extent to just harass the living hell out of me. So I'll keep it obtuse, but let's just say I have a contract with a public school system to perform mental measurements to determine what level of services a child or young adult is legally allowed under, free and appropriate education. I occasionally provide said services, and I also work for a local university, a couple of classes there, mostly in the areas of, statistics, assessment, evaluation, and psychology. So, mental measurements, psychology background, statistics, it all kind of goes in the blender and comes out where you've got a really skeptical guy. And while the doctorate I have is not in paranormal science, because there's no such thing, you and I pride ourselves on critical thinking. So I don't pretend for 1 minute that my day job or that my academic acumen has got anything to do with what people should believe I say. I don't want anyone to believe anything I say, because we always provide evidence that can be checked. So I don't care if anyone believes what I say. So starting there, we can go forward and say, my job and my degrees have nothing to do with what I say, because they have nothing to do with this independent research. Frankly, I don't believe anything anyone says, even if I do believe them to be a doctor of this or that, because I still prefer to kind of check the facts. And here's why. We've said, David and I, for a long time, and I've been saying it since 2004, first emailed it to someone. I had it as a lecture slide in 2005. The role of science should be to investigate the unexplained, not explain the uninvestigated. So if anyone's wondering where that phrase came from, that was the devil's advocate. And, we furthermore like to think that disciplined inquiry is the real and only way to arrive at any kind of truth. And I don't mean, like Stephen Colbert's truthiness, and I don't mean truth like, I found it, it's a religious experience. I mean like truth as in the formal logic sense, like premise A plus premise B, both of which are valid, and you do that through evidentiary standards, you validate them, equal C. So you've got this if, then, therefore thing, and that's what we kind of go with. And we try to vet our evidence, and we're not always perfect, but at least if we're always putting the evidence in the direct sunlight of disciplined inquiry, we tend to come out with what we consider to be the greatest non-biased truth. And that's really all we're after. We don't embrace woo-woo. The fact is, all this stuff is weird enough without throwing jackasses into the mix with fake devices, weirdos who think they talk to dead people. We don't need all that. There's enough real stuff going on that we don't need to muddy the waters with nonsense. And so that's kind of what we like to do to the field a favor and clean it up a little by, frankly, bleaching some of the stains upon the paranormal.
Yes. And you couldn't have put that any more eloquently. One of the things that we do is we do inquiry. We inquire into our own hypotheses and theoretical work. We're our own worst critic in a lot of areas. So we employ a very important principle in doing this called Occam's razor. And Occam's razor basically says that all things considered, the simplest explanation is usually the best. And I would say that about 95% of the time this holds true. People tend to overcomplicate things. They tend to clutter things with a lot of mumbo-jumbo that isn't really required. The stones have memories, and you do something and it triggers a replay of something that took place 100 years ago, or, just really just insane speculative statements with not one shred of anything backing up these statements. So we kind of go against those things. We look for something a little more pliable to work with. And my mantra is that if we can hear it, feel it, taste it, touch it, smell it, or experience it in any way, then it has to follow the laws of physics, or we wouldn't. So the trick is to find out which laws and how they're applicable. And that's really what all paranormal research is about. It's about finding what laws in physics are in play and looking for an explanation in science, not in the feathery realms, which is one of your terms that I have adopted and love using.
Yeah, that's it.
The feathery realms, I love that. So we started out kind of like two guys having coffee and shooting the crap over the telephone, and that's kind of how we started coming into people's living rooms and family rooms and whatever. And we had a cult following, which I thought was kind of fascinating because we had a lot of blog activity. We had a lot of people asking questions. We had a very dedicated group of loyal listeners who have probably along the way fallen by the wayside because we've moved all over the place over the years trying to find a valid home, which will allow us to say what we want to say without censor and without being scared of being threatened by lawsuits or any of this other nonsense that the people whose worlds we pick apart suffer from. So I think our new home is going to be kind of immune to that sort of thing. And that's a good thing. Not that we're going to go and do a bunch of hit pieces, but we might. Nothing is sacred around here. We even hit on ourselves. So during this period of time, we had you had a very nasty experience with trolls because you were taking on the ITT movement, which is a big band of charlatans and liars and frauds. And I believe we started with Mark Macy, A Stain Upon the Paranormal. And that just opened up a whole can of worms because these people pride themselves off of making money off of being uneducated and ill-informed. And we did our damnedest to point that out in a very sort of pseudo-eloquent way. But your phone was hacked. You had all sorts of personal issues where these trolls were literally attacking you. Unfortunately, in the field, that's a common occurrence. I've had my own experience very recently with it. And in spite of what they do, when they can't find anything on you, then they start generating things by making false profiles and doing all sorts of stuff, photoshopping things and that sort of stuff. But the beautiful thing about those folks is if you don't give them any grease, they generally don't go very far. So after a while, they just sort of fade away.
Yeah. Well, my problem was, of course, I had not really experienced such an aggressive lunatic before. So I thought I was going to use rationality and documents to just explain that this person is wrong. So the troll would first come off like, well, I'm not a follower of Mark Macy's, but I've got a problem with your background. So it started like that, you think. And then the problem with my background was, for some reason, coast to coast, you have to send them a bio. And then, I'm not bragging, but my bio is kind of long. And so coast to coast picked a few things so as to not read some entire big, long bio.
Right.
Well, one of the things they picked, I guess they thought the audience would find it like I'm a credible speaker, so it would help the interview, but they picked. He was a lecturer with Loyola. I think they said Loyola University, okay? Which,
right.
I didn't write Loyola University. I know Loyola in Maryland, and I know it's not a university. But anyway, that being said, of course I was employed by Loyola. So I even went so far as to I redacted my tax records from that time, and I posted them, and about half the message board cooled off, but this same lunatic was still hot on the trail. Next thing you know, I was getting calls at the Human Resources Department of the places I worked. So this didn't go anywhere good. So I decided you can't really deal with folks like that. So then I pursued legal means, finding out the person was overseas, that making it infinitely more difficult, but still there are protections for U.S. citizens against such harassment. So anyway, for a bit of time it was an ongoing case and an event, and it has since fallen by the wayside. But that being the case, my experience was I can't prove it was all one person. It'd be even worse, frankly, if it were like what's commonly called gang stalking now. But it involved home telephone late-night prank calls. It involved the usual troll stuff on like a forum like David's talking about, which, both of those I can handle. That's whatever. We've got broad shoulders. It's really not a big deal. I don't answer the phone late at night anyway, so the messages were quite entertaining, and whatever. I don't really read forums, so I don't really care what people say. Here's where it really got interesting. I began to receive EVP-like voices during certain phone calls. Okay? This is all documented in a report called Dark Adapted Ear. I released a public report of that, which you can find on David's Spirit site. So, here's what was happening. I was speaking with a researcher named Brian Jones. Now, whoever had cloned my phone, David ultimately arrived at this conclusion because being a legitimate, credentialed audio engineer, he found, in the audio evidence, he found, deep in the Gaussian hiss and the noise of the files I sent him, he found noise floors, and he found evidence of phone cloning, that this dude is on your end of things. He's not cloned the conversation, the person you're having a conversation with, he's cloned your phone. And that was quite obvious because only when I would have conversations with people I've spoken about the paranormal would this wispy EVP-like spooky voice enter into the conversation. Okay, so who knows what this was? This was either one of the Macy crowd, or who knows, I don't know. But it was obviously someone who would prefer to use an operation like this to its greatest end, and, not to be too sinister, but here's how I could see capitalizing it at the most. At the most, if I had believed these voices were ghouls, and then I went public with this conclusion like, David, I've got ghouls on my phone. And then the person who was cloning my phone and perpetrating this hoax upon me as a form of cyber harassment, high-tech cell phone harassment, they would have probably put up a website called, Rorke is a dumbass, and showed how, it was me all along. I bought an Israeli clone phone on New York City for $100, and look how I make Rorke look stupid. So I probably would have lost a lot of credibility if I had jumped to I have a ghoul on my phone, and I would have looked really dumb. That would have been a very successful psychological operation. But it didn't go that way, and so eventually now, the harassment stopped for one or two reasons. One, the person who cloned my phone must have heard the conversation with David, and or the person who cloned my phone had heard that I think my phone is cloned and that I no longer am going to record, analyze, or frankly tolerate any other whispery, feathery, loud voices. So I guess the game was over and that was no longer fun. But that's a pretty interesting level of harassment for a pretty inconsequential, quote-unquote, inconsequential field, which a lot of people would think.
Yeah, that was kind of cool because, when you know someone's listening, you can tell them what you want them to hear.
Oh, and we did. That's where the phrase "lock and load" came from. It ended every podcast for a while.
Yeah, I always tell people that's frankly why I carry a loaded .45 automatic on my hip generally when I'm in public. But Yeah, so we've had our run-ins with the dopes and the Kool-Aid drinkers and that sort of stuff along the way. And we've still managed to keep our senses of humor because they give us a lot to laugh about. But now, one of the things we were known for is our scientific discussions.
Yes.
I think some of our meditative discussions that we have had over certain topics have always been a favorite of our listeners, and I hope that we get back into that. I mean, one of the last things we were doing before we left our past network was we were sort of putting together a study about psychics and mediums. And we had interviewed probably 10 altogether, randomly. Well, 3 of them weren't random because they were all in the same family. But everyone else was sort of random. And we started finding a lot of commonalities. Now, unfortunately, my main PC crashed, and I lost a great deal of the data that we had collected, but we pretty much know from memory exactly what the commonalities were. And we found out that just about all of them had symptoms of fibromyalgia, which I thought was interesting. We also found that most of them were multi-talented, meaning that they had more than one PK ability. In other words, some of them, had lucid dreams. Some of them also had the ability to hear things. They had all these...
Isn't that called clairaudience? Yeah, clairaudience.
Clairaudience, clairvoyance. What is the other thing, like seeing from a distance, remote viewing. But we found that these people had multiple abilities. It wasn't like they just had one thing that they did. They had many sort of things in varying degrees of it, which I thought was pretty interesting. I think. I think some of your observations might be enlightening on that, because you were coming at it from a totally academic standpoint, not believing anything that you heard. And over the course of the shows, I think you had your eyes turned a little bit.
I did. And in fairness, you, of course, had an empirical knowledge base. And for the folks just started listening, that means David had experiential knowledge where he would arrive at some of this data regarding mediums in a way that was more credible to him because he was present. He commonly checked for any means of reproducing the, what would you call it, the apparent paranormal event. Knowledge arrives at in novel ways or predictions of the future that a person couldn't have otherwise known that turned out were true, things like this. And you arrived at those in an empirical sense, so of course they were much more highly credible. I had the luxury of sitting back like, just a real classic negativist and say, well, when I see some facts here, I'll make up my mind, So we were getting to the point where, frankly, there was a pattern emerging that reminded me more of a qualitative study where a person listens very closely to interviews, tracking them for self-emergent patterns, and, of course, noting themes. Well, there were quite a few commonalities that kept emerging that these are from people who didn't really know each other in most instances. So I'm thinking, how is this possible? This is, how is this as a psychological phenomenon even possible, unless it's some sort of a mass delusion, or perhaps it's a common, there's still a teeny tiny chance that in a given number of fantasy-prone people, they might kind of all exhibit typical. They might typify the same set of magical thinking. I mean, that's possible. But again, these folks were impressing my colleague David, who I have a lot of regard for. So I hardly think that they're just talented charlatans. So we were on our way to really figuring out some certainty when it comes to psychics. And that's saying something, because frankly, this whole psychic mediumship thing has been around forever, and no one's looked at it in a way using, and I use this phrase again, disciplined inquiry, which is, well, let me first qualify. People love scientific discussions about knowledge. Here's one about what we mean by certainty. We need to concede that certainty of knowledge, it's not like the common certainty people are thinking, like absolutely certain we know. Even in empirical matters, like David's direct observation and collection of data, even then, certain knowledge is impossible. Here's what's possible. Knowledge at its best is merely that which is probable, going back to Occam's razor, as in determining what hypothesis is best supported by the evidence we collect. So that's why the more evidence, the better. And this is also why people cherry pick evidence, and they also stop collecting evidence when they've got enough to agree with their preconceived notions. So in technical language, the search for an approximation of certain knowledge is to test a hypothesis. That's all we were going to do. We were going to test the hypothesis that went something like, is psychic mediumship a reality to the extent that certain people exhibit factors including, and we were going to make a list of factors, and then we were going to say that also exhibit or typify this set of abilities, and then we were going to make conclusions about what other sorts of indicators these people exhibited that might give us the ability to, quote-unquote, detect mediums or people who possess the ability for psychic mediumship in the future. That's what we were shooting for. But to be clear, we were checking for a hypothesis which, if true, would confer the highest probability on the available evidence, which would have then, therefore, had what they call the highest degree of explanatory power, but it wouldn't have been like the truth, or it wouldn't have been certainty of knowledge like people think, just to be clear.
Yeah, exactly. And what was important about this were these were people that I knew, that I had witnessed them in action. I knew that there were certain traits and statistical commonalities with them just from observation. So in a way, I loaded our guest list with only the ones that I was comfortable with knowing they were genuine to me. And even then, they were only genuine to a certain degree before we interviewed them. Now, what was interesting is, so many people say, well, you can't put any controls in place, blah, 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 this isn't really a scientific investigation. Oh, but it was, because we were looking for statistics. And statistical analysis is probably one of the most bleakest, drabbest, boringest scientific inquiry there is. However, it's the most telling because it openly displays trends. And those trends are the beef of your hypothesis. And that's what we were looking for. In the first couple of interviews, we didn't know what we were going to get because all we had were 10 questions that I had noticed commonalities in. And I had noticed that in many other self-proclaimed mediums, they had these same trends going on that were visible if you observed them for long enough. So the 10 questions we started with were very telling because they all answered those 10 questions very similarly, with their age, with the onset of their abilities, with the abilities jumping up a quantum level at some point in their life, other associated things. But what was really funny was the fact that few of them understood that they had symptoms of fibromyalgia. And it wasn't until I read each symptom and they answered, did they realize that they were literally suffering from symptoms associated with fibromyalgia. Now, that was the biggest statistical wow that occurred, was that even ones that openly said, no, I don't have fibromyalgia, and then when I asked the questions later in the interview, further down the road, so their mind wasn't still on that, they were answering, most of them answered to over 80% of the questions in a positive manner. We had one that named every one of them.
And technically that's epiphenomenon, but it's interesting that that epiphenomenon was predominantly consistent.
It was absolutely predominantly consistent and to a high degree, above random chance.
Way above. Yeah.
Way above random chance. So we established right off the get-go that these people have something going on, and they have something going on that affects them in a neurological manner.
For the eggheads out there, David, we established something called statistical significance, where any researcher should be looking at this saying, ooh, this is an interesting anomaly. What's up here?
Exactly. And see, the thing is that we weren't basing this on the accuracy of their information or what they were getting or anything else, because we didn't even ask questions about that. We did ask an anecdotal question about, give us an example of this or give us an example of that. But for the most part, we were talking about themselves as individuals and what they were going through, what they experienced. And that's where I found the reliable data to be, because we can subjectively look at content. We can say, oh, well, they're 85% accurate or they're 60% accurate. That's really not a usable statistic, number one, because their condition is variable. One day they may have an outstanding hit rate, and we established that during the questioning. Another day, it may be foggy. They may have fibro fog going on, and they may not be receiving so well. Kind of like in the old days when we used to watch TV and there were only 3 channels, and we had rabbit ears on the TV. Some days, without putting aluminum foil on it, we got a crystal clear picture. Everything was enjoyable and clear. There were no questions. Everything was understandable. And other days, you had snow coming in and out, ghost images happening, and you had to, hold the antenna, by the front door and hold one leg in the air while holding a roll of, aluminum foil in your left hand. And, all these other things, as you can remember as a child growing up, we used to do to get better TV reception. And we established that this PK reception of emerging information has a similar type of effect, where there are some days when the information is crystal clear and there's other days when it's not so much. So we're dealing with a type of interference that's involved in it. So that also showed up statistically. The fact that it was...
in fact, David, there was a study where you measured that, and I wasn't speaking out of turn earlier when I said that you had collected data in the form of a study and found that there was a significant correlation between, quote-unquote, verbal transmission of information and the environmental recording you had done. We were saying, whoa, it's as if there's a TV signal being sent to this person's brain. Anyway, that wasn't done for all of the interviewees, but the fact is you've got an experiential base when it comes to this that I did not. I was just explaining that part of it.
Right, and I even made the comparison that a medium is kind of like a biological television set, and the fact that they are receiving this emerging information and somehow demodulating it and getting valid information off of this carrier wave. Now, initially, I've observed this carrier wave emerging, and our network host, in fact, was present when we did an actual investigation at the Shanley Hotel, and where we were getting emerging information adjacent to the sensitives involved, and our network owner is actually a sensitive to a certain degree, and we had information emerging around him, and it blew his mind because he wasn't prepared to see that either. So we were getting, over a period of a year before we started doing the interviews, I was gathering field information, field data around sensitive individuals, and noting that there were commonalities occurring that were unique to them versus an ordinary person. So I knew there were environmental effects and environmental conditions that were conducive to good information, bad information, or information at all. And so that was the precursor for designing the experiment that we were doing, which was more of a mental experiment than it was a laboratory experiment, because we were dealing with interviews and subjective information being offered up. But this is a prime example of where you can collect subjective information and statistically categorize it to make it empirical information, because it forms.
Right. So, in other words, here's why it's still discipline inquiries, because you take the responses from the interviewees, in this case the voluntary subjects, and maybe none of them ever say the same thing ever, in which case you have zero correlation, you have zero themes emerging, you don't have a study any longer. Or you could have what we had, where they all tell a similar story about the emergence of the phenomenon at a certain age, what that event was like, how transformative it was, very similar issues regarding health. Anyway, the point is, there were emergent themes that piled up, and this became what David accurately referred to as trends. And, these trends were what revealed themselves as they're there.
Right. And see, that's the difference, that we don't see practiced. These methodologies are not practiced in the paranormal field today. Now, I haven't had a chance to talk to you about my experience this summer going to the Rhine Center. And so I kind of wanted to touch base on that in the last 15 minutes here of the show. I was there to present my wormhole theory, and it was really well received. I befriended not only Sally Rheinfelder, who is the daughter of J.B. Rhine, and Louisa Rhine, who is a near and dear friend of mine. We had lunch together, and she's just a neat old lady. And but the current executive director of the lab, who's a younger fellow, he's an engineer, he's a master's holder, he's not a doctorate, but he's doing some really cool research, and we got to talk. He gave me a tour of the lab and what he's doing. Here's what they're doing. They spent a lot of money, about $25,000, and they bought a photon counter. And this device counts individual ultraviolet photons.
I know where you're going, dude. You're going to the double slit reproduction.
This is beautiful. He made a black room, okay?
Yeah.
Normally in this room, when the doors are sealed and you're in it, there is a background control of between 4 and 8 photons per minute. I mean, this black frigging room.
So super low albedo and near zero light leakage.
Now, introduce a medium, and he used 3 different categories of people. He used mediums, he used healers, and he used martial artists. And he would get them in the room, stabilize the room readings, and then he would tell them, do your thing. And let me tell you what happened to ultraviolet photons. When healers began, the emissions came from the palms of their hands, the center of the palms of their hands, and it went up to 17, 18, 22,000 photons per minute.
22,000?
Dramatic, almost glowing with ultraviolet light. Mediums, same thing. Martial artists, using chi force, same thing. Measurable biofield radiation associated with their gifts. Now, the next series of experiments he's going to do is they're going to do things with out-of-body experiences to see if there's differentials in weight, to see if there's differentials in light emission. I'm working with them now, advising them on how to measure low-frequency EMF emissions. So now they're going to be totally studying the human condition during these periods of PK activity. So I was so excited to be a part of that, and that they shared that whole experiment with me. And I gave them a lot of really good ideas, and we promised each other we were going to stay in touch and we were going to work together towards refining and redefining these experiments. So they are doing some really cutting-edge, interesting research on the human condition, biofield radiation, and the association of us being luminous beings where we're actually generating light. And I got to discuss with him my theory on shadow people being life forms based on antiphoton emissions. So that they absorb light or cancel light or annihilate light when they come into contact. And because of this, a shadow person probably feels some pain or discomfort when exposed to photon bombardment, for regular, photon bombardment. Interestingly, in the new TV show, we do an experiment that pans out, and I won't go into details about it, but we do a research experiment, and we catch a shadow person, and the information is rather dramatic, and it's caught on camera. So, I was utilizing a 2,000-watt laser projection system that literally created a laser grid, high-output laser grid that covered about 100 square foot area. And I'll just say that the results were dramatic. It wasn't one of these little, lecture pointers, that put out like 0.4 milliwatts or whatever. This was a 2,000-watt laser grid projection system that I set up.
That's military grade, my friend.
Well, it's actually it's used in disco and DJ stuff. It's literally used for effects. The difference is, instead of it changing into all these different configurations constantly, I had it set on a specific pattern. And that pattern was used to bathe an area and to monitor that area with intense laser beam light. And we were able to, we had an event, and I made predictions, and I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, you made predictions. See, I know we have very few minutes left, but this is kind of what we come back to over and over and over again on the Devil's Advocate, is this business of the basics of the scientific method and discipline inquiry. Notice that we discussed earlier about the search for certainty. It's really the search for an approximation of certain knowledge, which is really to do what David did. You test a hypothesis, which, if true, confers the highest probability on the available evidence, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, but that means it has the highest degree of explanatory power.
Exactly.
And that available evidence tends to converge. So, don't reveal anything, but did the available evidence tend to converge or point in the same direction, such that you were able to have a kind of tentative or at least fallible conclusion about events that was interesting?
Absolutely. And see, that's the difference between a hypothesis. See, we have three things. We have a notion, which is just meaningless. We have a hypothesis, and then we have a theory. And where the hypothesis becomes the theory is when sufficient statistical information allows for a prediction of proposed data, and for that prediction to come true. Now you have a theory. And so many people misuse these terms, like a notion is a theory. It's no such thing.
Yeah.
A notion is a hypothesis. It's no such thing. I mean, most people consider a notion a hypothesis in the field, and it's no such thing. A notion is a notion, plain and simple. There's nothing to back it up. There's no observation to back it up. There's no evidence whatsoever. To have a hypothesis, you have to have some evidence.
And that's why you have a wormhole theory. You don't have a wormhole notion or a wormhole hypothesis, just the step-by-step approach innocently can begin with the kind of notion. It can begin with just a recognition of the mystery.
Absolutely.
But it's got to take the step where it turns into a formulation of a preliminary hypothesis that explains it. Then you acquire facts through observation and experimentation. Then you form a new hypothesis that adapts to the evidence collected, and then you test the new hypothesis for its explanatory or predictive value. Most people don't do the last four steps.
Now, let me just say this. What do we call that?
Well, that's called the scientific method.
Thank you.
we learned it in fourth grade.
Yeah, and I hear so many people go, "Oh, we use the scientific method." Really?
No, you don't.
I don't mean like a scrub brush when you're taking a bath. Do you know what the scientific method is? And they don't. They think because they use, blinky lights and talk to boxes that's the scientific method. That isn't.
Yes. Oh, I've got a great saying. A guy I used to work with and collaborate with, Jim Hale, used to remind people all the time, the technology is not the experiment.
It is.
That's a good way of saying people get so wrapped up in their K4 meter that they don't really know what they're doing.
That's exactly right. And they are taking those blinky lights and assigning arbitrary value to it. And that's an important thing to remember. They're assigning arbitrary value.
Well, actually, they're not entirely arbitrary. They're assigning values that comport with their predetermined conclusions.
Well, to me, that's just arbitrary.
Yeah, it may as well be, but let's be honest. There's a psychological motivation to what they assign to it. Yeah.
And that's the whole meme thing, There's a whole meme.
Oh, yeah.
There's a whole meme involved in declarations, just random declarations of fact that are nonsense. And that's the big thing that we fight. That's the thing that we are constantly battling because people want to do good, but they also want to see a ghost. So everything you collect is evidence.
But they also claim, David, to want to elevate the paranormal to a discipline. Well, if that's ever going to happen, we better start at least holding it to the standards of a field of inquiry. Right now, it's not even a field. We can't even call it a field. God knows it's far from a discipline.
Oh, it's the most undisciplined bunch of folks that there are. And that's the problem. You don't have people repeating steps. You have random, just throw something out there. They don't work a room in a grid pattern. They don't, it's like, it's great when I do an investigation because it blows people's minds when I show up and I have no equipment. And I tell them to break out their equipment and I show them how to use their whatever they have in the most effective manner to get usable evidence. Even though you have a cheap, crappy K2 meter, you can still deploy it in a manner that you can get usable data from. But you have to do that by doing the right methodologies. And when I start working a room in a grid pattern like you're searching for a downed aircraft, they're looking at me like I'm crazy. But you know what? Before I leave, everyone's working the room in a grid pattern because they're understanding what it means to do that. They're seeing how they can be 1 foot away from a source and not measure it, and yet their next pass pick it up where they were a foot away from it on the previous pass. So it's a search. It's a search for evidence, and that search has to be done in a very methodical way. So, I love doing these investigations that I lead. When I went to Bobby Mackey's, I actually took the handheld REMFD that allowed me to look at the waveforms, and we caught a lot of what I call biofield emanations that we think are associated with disembodied consciousnesses. And we captured it on video. We captured the waveforms on video, and it's on it's on my YouTube site. So these were done because we worked the area in a grid fashion. And we caught these things in various locations in the building. So there's a method to the madness, and there's no shortcuts. If you're going to do research, there's no shortcuts. You have to slog it out, and you have to cover every square inch that you can cover.
Yeah, I would say 2 words about conversation: disciplined inquiry.
That's it. So, Stephen, we're out of time, I believe.
There you go. We've done it.
I'm showing 10 o'clock straight up on my computer here, and I think this was a great introduction to what the possibilities and probabilities of future shows will be, and that was my goal tonight. And I'm looking forward to you getting a new computer and a camera so that I can look at your expressions and your gestures and your animations. And let's join us again, folks, in 2 weeks when the devil's advocate hits the pavement with all 4 wheels running.